Welcome back to Expedition 44, here with your usuals, Matt and Ryan. Today we are super excited to have one of our good friends, Will Hess. Will is the youth and missions pastor of One Life Church in Evansville, Indiana. He's also part of an incredible podcast called The Church Split. He's got a degree from Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, where he continues his education. He's got second baby on the way. But Matt and I are really good friends with Will. We kind of do a lot of banter back and forth with them, text messages, things like that. So we're excited to have him today. We've been in a series of interviewing authors with the likes of Scott McKnight, John Walton, Preston Sprinkle, Steve Gregg. Peter Enns is coming soon. We've had Brian Zahnd and Greg Boyd. And today we are no less excited to have Will Hess here. Will, tell us a little bit about yourself and your recent release that is going to be coming out and dropping on Reformation Day.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me on. First and foremost, I've been a big fan of Expedition 44 and the ministry you guys do here for quite some time. In fact, when this topic came up, your guys' channel was a huge resource for me. So my name is Will. I am, again, the host of the Church Split. I've been in pastoral ministry for about 10 to 12 years. My big focus is theology and apologetics. That's my passion. That's my love. I'm the guy who, instead of reading fiction novels, likes to read theology books, which makes people bored and sleepy, but I find them interesting. So I've been really excited about talking about this book. It is my new book, Crushing the Great Serpent. Did God Punish Jesus? This is kind of a love letter of my own and my own passion project. And what's cool is that these guys here helped me with this book themselves. Will here, he helped me out with the cover and the design. And of course, Matt, you wrote my foreword and gave me other valuable resources during the writing of this. So I'm really excited to be here. But my background is I was originally, I was raised a fundamentalist Baptist, like King James only. You have to wear suits and ties, hymns singing, hellfire, brimstone preaching. Hey, man, you know what I mean? Like that's what I was raised as. And of course, I am no longer that. I am. I think I am kind of he who must not be named in that world. Actually, at this point, one of their larger pastors that are becoming more well known, and he actually is in the area. When he talked to me, I met him. He seemed like all he wanted to do was get away from me, which was pretty funny. But just because that's my fundamentalist background, and I'm no longer that. I actually go to a non-denominational evangelical hipster church is what I call it. And that's where I'm pastoring, and that's where I'm actually very much at home. I love it here. But what happened with me is, long story short, is I preached the classic doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement, that Jesus died in the place of mankind, that God poured his wrath out on his son, and he punished Jesus in our place. And I preached that for years until over time, it broke my brain a little, because I used to also be very Augustinian. I was raised believing in inherited guilt, that mankind inherits guilt from Adam, that we are born evil and sinful. And over time, I began, when I read Ezekiel 18, that is actually kind of what broke my brain on the entire situation. So Ezekiel 18 talks about how God will not punish the son for the deeds of the father, and he will not punish the father for the deeds of the son, which puts God in direct juxtaposition to pagan gods and pagan societies. One of the things I mentioned is in like Hammurabi laws before the show, was that like if a man sexually assaulted a woman, then someone would sexually assault that man's wife. So she would be punished and humiliated for his crime. So this is God saying, no, I am not like the other gods. I am unique. And that broke my ability to even hold to inherited guilt. And then I kind of developed what I would consider a more orthodox view of what sin is. And then I didn't realize so about 2 years later that actually caused huge problems for my atonement theory, because my view of Christ's death, burial, resurrection was that, God transferred our sins to him. He bore our sins, and then God killed him. And I'm like, well, if we can't have our sin transferred, then that puts that atonement model up on the ropes. And that therein began my long study. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to you guys for just a minute here, and then I'll explain a little bit of why the fire that got me to actually write the book.
Well, boy, you already say so many things that I'll say are triggers that like I think everybody watching this is like going, "Oh yeah, I've been there. I've done that." Like I think I've had a dozen of those in just what you said just now. And so we're similar. Matt went through very similar things to what you went through to get there. I was a little freed of that. My father was a circuit riding preacher. Makes it sound like I'm from the 1800s, but Christian church. And like I remember growing up, like he had a problem with all that too. So I was kind of raised in a little bit better of a life, but also was raised saying like, you got to be completely unbiased of looking for truth, and you got to, when you don't believe something, you really need to like find the other side of it. And like I say this all the time, but if you look at my library, this is just the digital library behind me. If you look at the real library, I probably own more books on things that I don't agree with than books that I do agree with. And I'm a emphatic reader, kind of like what you said. I probably read 10 books a week. I mean, I just, fly through these books, and out of those 10, at least 70% of them are usually things that I don't agree with. I'm reading through it and everything, and like there's a red flag on every page. Yet I think that helps you approach that conversation. And that's one of the things that I want to say about your book specifically that really jumps out at me differently than some of the other books out there is you can't help but read your book and get that transparent, I'm going after the truth here. I'm not afraid to look under every rock and be open to different opinions and different thoughts. And it always helps. Sometimes in theology, people aren't afraid to admit that they're changing a view on something. And like if you're not changing views, there's actually something wrong along the way. If you're not changing views, if you're so stuck on what you thought was true at the beginning, you're probably not really pursuant of truth the way that you should be. And so that is the one thing that I mean, I love a lot about your book, but one thing that really jumps out at me is I really like how that comes out in your book over and over is you're really going after, you don't care about the camps, you don't care about the views, you're just going after, sitting back and taking an exegetical view of the scripture and, let's say ontological or philosophical, what really makes sense. Where do you land working through all these different things? You do a great job of that. And Matt, is a little bit different from when we go through this, most of these interviews. I haven't talked this much in any of these interviews, by the way, but Matt's usually the guy that kind of starts this off. And I decided to do it this time because Matt's a little different with this book because he wrote the foreword. And those of you that know Expedition 44 well know that we've got, I don't even know how many part series on atonement where we really jump in. And Will, you already mentioned that. Thank you for mentioning that.
Mhm.
But this is not only a specialty area for Will, but Matt and I also have really gone after this area. And like, we are so happy that you wrote this book. This is one that we say, like, we joke about what books do we need to write? And this is one we were going to write and said, you know what? We don't need to write this anymore. Will just wrote pretty much what we would write. So Matt, give me a little bit of your involvement in this, your relationship with Will, and also kind of expound on the forward branch of this.
Yeah, I was really excited to be, I guess, Will to invite me into the process on this. Our good mutual friend, Scott Mercer, introduced us on the Marco Polo app. It's like a video walkie-talkie, I guess, if you don't know what Marco Polo is.
That's such a good way to describe it. Yeah, I always say Snapchat for adults, but that's
Yeah,
better. That's it's better because then you're not bringing up
Snapchat.
Snapchat,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
shady. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah, you could keep the videos. So, um, yeah, our good friend Scott introduced us. Yeah, it was funny. Will, you should tell the story about how he didn't know who I was.
Yeah, so real quick, that was actually really funny. So
Yeah.
my buddy was so I've watched Expedition 44, but I guess I never realized it was like Matt Mouzakis. I just knew Matt and Will, and I was confused because it was Will Ryan, which are both first names, and so I was like Will Ryan,
Yeah.
like, and so I was just trying to always figure it out. Like I was like, I don't know, but I binged your Atonement playlist probably 4 times when I was just processing. I just like would go through it, then
You
I'd
might have a new record there. We got to make some kind of plaque for you or
yeah,
something.
I'll put it right there next to the big sign. But so I was a huge fan of it. I was like, this is so nice because when I looked it up, of course, I found Mike Winger's series and I was unimpressed with, yeah, I'm going to do a response to him. I love the man, but
Yeah.
yikes. But
Yeah.
I found your guys's. And then Scott Mercer, who him and I have a similar background, and that's how I know Scott through the fundamentalist world, and he also has jettisoned from that world. And he was like, "Dude, you gotta talk to my good friend Matt. He is like a theology whiz, like, and he's on this stuff like you are about the atonement and all that. Like, I'll connect you guys. I'll connect you guys." I'm like, "All right, sounds good, I guess." And then like you're on like the Polo app. So I'm looking at my phone and he's just talking like, hey, so I meet you. We're like chatting about it. And I'm like watching. I'm like, I've seen this face and heard that voice before. Where is that? And I'm just like, and I think it was like 3 or 4 polos back and forth. Then finally I was like, you mentioned your podcast, and then you said Expedition 44, and I was like, oh my goodness, I'm talking to him. Like like it was just so funny because it was not intentional. It was Expedition 44 was a resource that I used, and it was a place of solace for me. And
Yep.
actually, I even had it in my acknowledgments. I was going to mention Expedition 44, and it just like I don't know why it took me that long to figure it out. But it was anyway. It was just funny. It was just that moment of like, oh my
That's
goodness,
awesome.
I'm actually talking to that guy right now.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah, that was funny. And then Will and I, through that, became good friends, and we both live in Indiana, and so we've hung out, and we're both connected through Trinity, where I got my bachelor's and master's through, and both of us have studied under Jonathan Pritchett and Braxton Hunter there. So we had some mutual stuff there, but um, yeah, we were working together on your Google Doc as you were writing this, and so I would just make comments of like, "Hey, have you, like you said, have you thought of this?" and just kind of dropping some ideas and resources, and
yeah,
um,
you'd be like, hey, this is a good point, but you can further that point with this. And I'm like, oh, I did not know about that. So it was just this really good thing where I added them later, like a good chunk of the manuscript had been done. And then Matt came in and just like combed through it and just made it better.
so that was fun, and I was really honored that you asked me to write the foreword, and um, I think some of it, like I started out kind of telling you a little bit of my story, how like I grew up, I mean, not in a completely like fundamentalist background, but very much in a church that affirmed PSA, and it was really the only atonement theory I had heard of growing up. And really, I started as I read the Bible further, started studying it in seminary, started asking like questions like about like if God punished Jesus, then how is the Trinity not divided? Like if God calls us to forgive our enemies as he forgave us, but if he forgave us by punishing his son, are we supposed to punish our enemies then to forgive them?
Right.
Like questions like that. How can an innocent person be deemed basically how can they be punished and how can that be deemed just? You know, all these different things. Uh Even questions about wrath, like when the Bible, like I read through it multiple times looking for um basically wrath being appeased on the cross, and the cross, and nowhere in the Bible does it ever say that God's wrath was satisfied on the cross. There's not a single verse in the Bible that says that. Yet it's just assumed through basically Calvinistic tradition. And
Right, right. And one possible meaning of one single Greek word,
yep,
essentially.
yep. And so I kind of went through, and in my intro I really break down what I believe N.T. Wright really does a great job with this quote that I've referred to many times when I've taught in many different circumstances, which is N.T. Wright argues that Christians have made a three-layered mistake when answering questions about salvation. First, we have Platonized our eschatology, substituting souls going to heaven for the promise of new creation. So that's one area. The second is we've moralized our anthropology basically by qualifying examination of moral performance. So basically, our anthropology, the way that he sees it, is a lot of salvation is all about behavior modification rather than the biblical notion of the vocation of the image of God. And you get into that a lot in your book. And the third thing is that we've paganized our soteriology by substituting the idea of God killing Jesus to satisfy his wrath for the genuine biblical notions that you explore through this entire book, Will. And so that's kind of the way I approached kind of my forward there, and looking at really the cosmic scope of salvation that you unpack of cosmic restoration, deliverance from the powers, reconciliation to God, restoration of the human vocation, and transformation into Christ's image.
Right. Amen. And that's actually so. And for me, I thought it was funny because you and I talked about how we kind of got to where we're at through different means. I tend to be, even though I got a degree in theology, I tend to be more philosophical in my thinking. So if I start finding philosophical problems, it drives me crazy because if it seems to violate the laws of non-contradiction, stuff like that, it just really starts bothering me. You're very exegetical, which I like to be, but I first usually get there with a philosophical framework. Like that's just the first way I go about it. You and I just go from, we just kind of swap it and we still get there. And I thought it was funny because you're like, it was interesting reading your book because you actually kind of approached it with like a philosophical frame of reference first. I'm like, that's how I think. That's actually what's kind of, I think, what goes in favor of the book, which is the idea that it is literally you're walking through my mind and me just going, all right, let me walk you through what happened and then just take you through all the different topics. And so for me, yeah, the whole idea of punishing someone in my place, people always make it out like, and then Jesus stepped in, right? God was about ready to punish us and he stepped in and he took the bullet, and like how much love, how greater love has love than no greater love has any man than he who lays his life down for a friend. And I go, yes and amen, but cool. Jesus took a bullet for me. But in PSA, it was God who fired the bullet. It was God's going to pour his wrath out and killed Jesus. And in addition, we make it out like, but look how just that was. Like, look at this innocent man gave his life up, But we also forget the fact that, yes, okay, so now we're declared innocent because this one man was put to death. But what does that say about the judge? Right? Like, if you're a judge and you're like, this guy's committed murder, I'm going to put you on death row. And then some Joe Schmo who is innocent walks in and goes, no, punish me instead. And the judge goes, sure, you'll do. Then it says that the guilt doesn't really matter. The person doesn't really matter who's punished. What matters is that there is just a punishment regardless of persons.
Yeah, there's all kinds of philosophical problems, and I mean, we might get into that, but I mean, on the same note, I would say you always hear of like, he took his place for me. Well, if you look at it as Jesus trading his life for every person of all humanity, who wouldn't do that?
Right.
Like you or I would do that. Like if that was really the deal, it's not some amazing great sacrifice that PSA would have it be said, because who wouldn't do that?
Paul
Anybody would
says
do
he'd
that.
do it himself for his own
Yeah,
kinsmen.
yeah.
So,
And I mean, the fact of the matter is, you'd probably do it for your own wife, daughter, significant. I would do it for either one of you guys, for one, not just the whole world. So there's already philosophical problems in moving into something like this that just don't really hold water, and that's what we're getting into. So I'm already seeing this. The problem with our conversation with the three of us is this could go on for 40 hours on this conversation. And
true.
so I mean, like, and maybe it should. Maybe we need to make this a 20-part series of working through your book, but let's keep moving here. So, Matt, I loved your foreword. I don't always like forewords on books. Sometimes I even like I'll read the foreword, then I read the book, and I think, did this person not even like read the book? It's almost like contradictive to what the book says. And that's not the case here. Like, you guys are so intertwined from the foreword to what the rest of the book says. It's excellent. And so I talk to people all the time that can't read 3 pages, and no offense, Will, but if anybody can't read 3 pages, at least read the foreword on this one. It's
No
phenomenal.
offense taken.
um, chapter 1, again, like, Will, you and I have so much in common. I love that you start out with the Star Wars trilogy. You entitled chapter one Confessions, and boy, Star Wars was really masterful. I mean, I'm convinced that George Lucas has like a doctorate in theology because so much of what he goes through actually, like, we could talk about Star Wars and PSA all day long and some of the implications in there. You also mentioned Dungeons and Dragons, and I don't know that I've ever admitted this online, but when I was at Moody, a bunch of us like found out we kind of were going that way. And you got to remember, I was in there during like the somewhat gothic days of like Skinny Pumpy, all that, and then Nirvana, and so it's like this weird like all black kind of Kurt Cobainish lifestyle, but like we would lock our doors and play D&D, and like, you start this chapter off talking about Star Wars and D&D, and it's this weird mindset because you entitle it Confessions. And when you think about what a confession is, you might think of it in terms of like law or religion or maybe a love confession, or it could mean a whole bunch of different things. But I love the fact that you use that because it goes into some ideas that your predefined notion of religion, Christianity, everything else might have been a little messed up. And that's kind of what a confession does, is it says, let's get back to transparency.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that was actually kind of the point, because one of the things for me, if I really always do better when I feel like I connected with the author, like if they speak more personally. And for me, I'm like, I've always liked the idea of writing a book, but I mean, as I said in my first chapter in Confessions, I was like, but I was very happy as a consumer because I didn't think there's anything I could possibly contribute to the conversations that people already have. Like, I mean, if there's another book on reasons for the faith, or if there's another book on I don't know, variations of the Gospels. I mean, like, we have so many things that's like, okay, that's been talked about ad nauseum. The kingdom, that's been talked about ad nauseum. I don't know if there's anything else I could contribute. And then when this topic came up for me, when my atonement theology unraveled, I started just devouring anything I could about atonement, but I was getting really frustrated because I couldn't find a single book that I could just pick up and go, hey, Joe Schmo who has 6 kids, works a full-time job, you're a deacon at your church, and you're the maintenance guy, and also you volunteer at your whatever Kiwanis club. Like, can I just give you one book and you get a really good view? I couldn't find it. In fact, it would be like a book like this on the incarnation. Then you get to Milgram's Levitical commentary, and it's like 1,200 pages. And it's like,
Yep.
okay, to unpack all these things, there's really no book that is like the one that I would say is the one that knocks out the pillars. There was one book that got close and was actually gifted to me by the author. His name is Philip Hess. No relation. And he had such a good title. It's called Penal Substitution on Trial.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's good. That one was close because it just talked about more at Christus Victor and how it answers PSA. But I didn't think it dealt with some of the other topics I really needed to deal with. So that's when I was like, fine, I'll do it. But what really got me doing it was the reason why, the fire that got me to actually do it, because I was flirting with it, was actually Dr. James White on his channel called me a heretic because he took a clip of mine that I said that I don't believe God poured his wrath out on Jesus. And that's all I said. I don't believe he poured his wrath out on Jesus. And I got called a flaming heretic essentially for it. And for months on Twitter, email, I was harassed. I mean, it was just frustrating because it's like no one wanted to hear me out. And when I'd explain my position, in fact, I had a Calvinist finally jump in on Twitter and goes, okay, do you believe in God's wrath? I was like, yes, I just believe it's those who reject him that are punished in the end. And he goes, okay, so you're not denying God's wrath. You don't deny that Jesus died for the sins of the world. Then why is everyone yelling at you? And I'm like, your guess is as good as mine. And that was a Calvinist who even said that. So a Calvinist actually came to my defense. But it was enough fire in my belly to go, no, there's good reasons. And I'm going to put that to paper. And so that's what happened. I put it to paper, and now here we are. But yeah, Confessions really that was the whole point, was just to kind of be like, also just explain the fact that like, I'm just a guy. Like, I'm a nerd. I like the original Star Wars trilogy. I like D&D. I like gaming. I have Dune in the back here. Like, I do like fiction stuff. Even though I mostly consume theology, but I love fiction. And I love nerd culture. But at the same time, I had to realize that once I came to a certain point, in my theology, I have to just acknowledge the fact that something is wrong and none of us have perfect theology and it's time to switch or it's time to at least look into it. One of the biggest problems I have is that a lot of people will just try to redefine, they'll try to keep the title, but redefine it as opposed to just going, well, then just don't say you hold to the title. Because there's a point when you redefine something to such a point that words mean nothing.
Yeah.
I love NT Wright.
Oh
Everyone
yeah,
knows that.
gonna
I
bring that
love
up.
NT Wright, but he says he affirms penal substitutionary atonement, and a lot of people accuse him that he doesn't. And it's funny because he goes, "No, I believe sin was put to death. That's penal substitution. He died instead of all." Like he kind of redefines some of these things, and I'm like, people are kind of right though. You know, it's to call him out on that, where it's like, no, you are redefining a historical term, so just don't
Like
affirm
do
it.
it, yeah, like what he believes is substitutionary atonement, but not penal substitutionary atonement. He removes the vicarious part of that, where the sin is vicariously put onto a subject, and then punished for that.
100%. Yeah.
And
He
yeah,
does come out in the one that it's Ask NT Wright. He does that. So when it got controversial, he does come out and say exactly what you just said, Matt. I mean, he said,
oh yeah,
well, technically, from the definitions of the PSA camp, I don't affirm the penal part of it, but I do affirm substitutionary atonement. And so I mean, it took him a long time to get there, but I mean, I think that was made clear, and I agree with what you guys are saying with it's a hard one. Like people are sort of using that one. And, Will, you said something about Alyssa Childers about, she kind of says anybody who denies PSA are theological liberals or progressive Christians. You kind of get into the orthodox language, things like that. And I think that it's worth having a quick conversation over. Matt and I deal with this a lot too, in that,
Hmm.
like, you kind of have this understanding. And I will say something. I give PSA, if I'm going to give them credit anywhere, I'm going to give PSA credit of saying, like, the greater majority of the church hears what PSA says and they just believe that that's what the Bible says, and that if you don't believe that, then you might be contrary to scripture, where small groups like you and I work through it and we say, actually, the Bible, we don't think says that.
Right. And so that's actually, that was another frustrating thing is people like Mike Winger or people like Lisa Childers, people with gigantic platforms. I mean, these are really extremely well-known individuals.
Yep.
And I believe once you're that, especially, I think anyone with a platform has a responsibility, but when you're that big, I think you have an absolute responsibility to be careful in what you say. And it really bothered me when I'm like labeled a progressive. Now, if anyone knows me, I'm basically like red pill hardcore conservative. Like Matt knows this. Like him and I talk, pretty frequently, and I am very conservative. To be called a progressive, just blows my mind because I am the farthest thing from it. But at the same time, I can understand where they did it because penal substitution became the litmus test for all Protestants, whether or not you're Orthodox in a Protestant view. So that is all part of that. I mean, it is and then in addition to that, we have to understand the fact that the Bible, we all have a grid, right? Okay, so we're reading the Bible, we all have a grid. If you're a dispensationalist, for example, you're going to be reading it through a dispensational grid. If you are a covenant theologian, you're going to do the same thing, and on we could go. Your PSA, your penal substitutionary atonement, is a grid as well. Every time you read died for you, you reinterpret that as a substitutionary language.
yeah,
Right. And but that there's more ways you could die for somebody, right? Soldiers die for our country all the time. And they die for us, doesn't mean they die in our place. They die to give us various perks like freedom, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, whatever. So these are all things that, like, no, let's actually read the Bible. Let's take our time to comb through it and ask the question, what does the text actually say in here? And am I bringing a grid that is actually foreign to the text and place it on the text? Because in a way, you're like, to steal a progressive term, there is actually like some cultural appropriation going on there. You are
Yeah.
shoving your 16th century lens onto an ancient text. And that happens, by the way. And I don't want to like tell people that they're the world's worst people for doing it, because we all do it.
Right.
And that's why
Right.
we have to work to not. And that's why, like, it's funny. I wrote a book against penal substitutionary atonement, but I'm probably more sympathetic to people who hold it, because I
Hmm.
understand that linchpin. I understand how that happens. And I understand that it was a multi-year journey for myself, let alone everyone else.
Yeah, it's so true when you think of it that way, and a lot comes down to like that whole thing of the, like you said, cultural appropriation, redefining of words, um, where Ryan and I say all the time, like, where sometimes English is not very specific, at times Greek is very specific, and there's these four words that you unpack in this four anti, super, Perry, all of that, and show that it's benefit language the whole time. So
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
Right. 100%.
Will, next you get into this thing where you call it a sobering realization. I like that wording that you use because I've been there a million times. Can you kind of describe that a little bit?
Well, when you have been preaching one particular thing for the better part of 10 years, and you realize you're wrong, it is a sobering feeling. I mean, if anyone's ever heard me preach, they know I don't really pull punches. I speak what I say, what I mean. I mean what I say. I'm very direct. And then to just be like, I've been preaching wrong this entire time. There's a guilt thing I dealt with there too. Like James really always sticks out to me. Like, not all of you should become teachers, because you will be held at a higher standard. And it's like,
Yep.
it was humbling. It was this whole realization of, I know this is wrong, but I don't know if there's a replacement for it. Is there another way to view this? And that was all stuff I was wrestling with, because that was when I did find your series, and it helped me kind of like wrap my brain around there are alternatives. And that's when I started realizing that a lot of these other theories, because I was always told penal substitution is the core of the gospel and all the other theories are orbit around it. I started realizing that no, things like Christus Victor, recapitulation, moral example, these are the core. But that was the sobering realization for me, was actually going, oh man, the more I read this, the more I see that there was no thing that says God needed to satisfy his wrath by punishing somebody. There was no idea that the Isaiah 53 and all these other places actually aren't saying what people say it means. And those were things that stuck out to me. So it was very sobering. It was very humbling to realize the fact that this, forthright preacher boy, uh, was wrong, even though he spoke so confidently and boldly. And that is
Yep.
actually one of the things I will say. Even people like R.C. Sproul and others, they say a lot of things confidently and boldly, but don't be deceived by it, because it doesn't mean they're right.
Yep. Yeah. One thing I loved in your book is, so you start out philosophically. You like paint the philosophical argument, telling your story first, going into like defining penal substitution in like the creators of its own words, which is pretty damning. Like when you read
Yes.
it, like that chapter 2 is awesome. Then you can contrast like, what did the early church believe? Like you go through stuff from like the early fathers, basically the Eastern view of it, which is about healing, versus the Western view, which is about retribution. We've already talked about transmission of sin, but then you like get into a whole bunch of like Old Testament stuff. Like I think really at some of the foundation of this is the understanding of sacrifice and offering,
Mm.
and the understanding of like the Exodus and the Day of Atonement, and that speak to a little bit of maybe the things that you uncovered in your book pertaining to Old Testament foundations.
Yeah, and I'm not going to lie. When you say chapter 2, what is penal substitutionary atonement? That is probably my favorite chapter in the entire book, because I do think it is, which is funny because it's actually the one setting up like the people I disagree with, which is why, again, your library should have people you disagree with. But because when you actually read it in their own words, the problems really do start sticking out.
Mhm.
Yep.
There's that famous statement by R.C. Sproul, which is like, he says that it's as if the father looked at the son and said, "God damn you," and it's like, yikes, like that caused
Yeah.
Christological problems. And then he goes on to say, and
Right.
I don't have this part in the book, but he says he was anathema. And like Paul says, anyone who says that actually is like way outside. Let's just I'll put it in some light terms. You're outside orthodoxy at that point. Martin Luther says some wild stuff too. And I could go on, but the point is that these people have said some crazy stuff. But then, well, yeah, for me, I felt like I had to go back to the beginning because every time I would try to look at Jesus's death, these things, Paul references first fruits offerings. They reference Passover. They reference so many things in the New Testament that point to the Old Testament, which means I had to go back there. Like, okay, but what is the way to understand that? And Milgram has an incredible, it's a classic commentary on Leviticus, Jacob Milgram, but I also recommend Jeremy Davis's much smaller book, Welcoming Gifts. It's much more digestible and a lot less intimidating, but both are fantastic. And so what I did was once I got into the offerings, I began to realize how different Israel really was in their sacrificial system in comparison to the pagans. Their sacrificial gifts were just that. They were gifts. We always think of it as, because people are like, well, why did the animal have to die? Because we always think death equals punishment. But for them, it was more like death was just the means to get blood and to get meat. In fact, it was like basically religious meat production. Because what many people don't seem to remember is the fact that a lot of those offerings were actually consumed as meal.
It was a meal with your God.
Yeah. Exactly. It was, you're breaking bread with your God. You're sitting down at the table and you're breaking bread with him. You're eating, just hanging out at the barbecue. But God is spirit. And so that is why the word that is used actually to describe the smoke that ascends, it actually means like to be transformed or turned into smoke. In other words, it is ascending to God for his own consummation, for his own consuming. And then that is why it's pleasing to his nostrils. Because it's this idea of, we've all been at a barbecue, man. And what have we said? That smells good. I can't wait to eat that. We've all done that at a barbecue. And that's exactly what these are. They're all for different purposes. Some of them, like the peace offering, we always think it's like, oh, making peace with the angry God. But it's actually not that. It's actually thanking God for the peace and blessings he's brought into your life.
Well-being.
Yeah, your well-being. It's you're the peace in your life. And those were like community parties. Like everyone would come to the cookout and you'd cut up the meat, you'd give God his portions, and then everyone shared in food. And that's because back then, and we even see that still exists in the New Testament, to share a meal with somebody is a symbol of covenant and fellowship. And which is why Paul says if someone is committing sexual immorality, I don't even share a meal with such a one, because he's saying that you're in fellowship with someone, and he's saying that you're not, because that's unholy. So separate yourself, right? So these little things culturally were completely missed to me. And then of course that always brings in the question, what about the blood? We have a lot of songs, nothing but the blood of the lamb, and there's a lot of songs about blood, 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 blood. Mm-hmm. And of course, atheists levy that against Christians, and they say it's some sort of weird blood magic, and it's not that. What it is, and this actually was mind-blowing for me because it's so obvious in the text once you know it. But if you don't know it, you just skip over it for whatever reason, and your brain doesn't register it. But blood is a symbol of purification, of life, and of covenant. We think blood as punishment, or blood as, we think gore, we think horror movie, we think violence. For them, they looked at the life or the soul, nefesh or nechesh, is in the blood. And so if it's in the blood, that's its life, that's its soul. Okay, great. And then if I'm pledging myself in covenant to you, means I'm pledging my life to you with my blood. My life is pledged to you. And so when they would cover the instruments in the temple with blood, it was actually because they believed sin or uncleanness as a whole was aerosolized. It was kind of like bad BO, bad body odor. And and it contaminated. It would go work its way into God's house, and you'd have to kind of scrub that off. Well, what is uncleanliness? Was corruption. It's death. So you take life and you take the blood of life and you purify the death. It's that simple. Mm-hmm. But we don't think of it that way. And what's funny is that once I actually started studying this, scholarship has been talking about this for years.
Oh yeah.
It was like, wait, this has been around for how long? This isn't like some recent revelation that we've had of the ancient.
Yeah, you could find it in the church fathers even.
Yeah, exactly. It's been around for forever. Scholars have talked about it for decades, and we just have ignored it and in favor of dogma. And that is actually what I would say. It is. We literally, this happens all the time to the church. We take what is fact and we actually will ignore the fact for dogma because for us, we're like, oh man, but if we change this position, that way lies madness. No, that way sometimes lies the truth. And it's actually a great thing. So yeah, I walked through that. The Day of Atonement was fascinating because I mean, we've all heard it, right? Jesus is our atonement. So he is both goats, but really what it is like, just like the sin goat had the sin transferred to it, so was our sin transferred to Jesus. And then he was killed right in our place. The big problem with that view is that the goat that has sin transferred or confessed over it, really is what it says, is confessed over it, it's just sent out into the wilderness. It's not put to death.
Yeah.
It's cast away from them. And then the other goat gets killed. So it's the exact opposite of what you would expect if that interpretation of penal substitution unto the Day of Atonement ritual is true. And these are all the things that when I studied them, I felt the ground kept continually falling out from beneath me because I could not connect PSA to anything.
Yeah.
In fact, and you could probably talk about this but like, yeah, Israel was considered the new Eden. The sin goat was just supposed to be cast out of it because it didn't belong there. It's supposed to be purifying. So,
Yeah.
what are you going to
And
say there,
even
Matt?
I was gonna say even the Exodus, like it's a judgment on the gods of Egypt. It's not the lamb wasn't punished to deliver like Israel. I'm like they enjoyed it as a meal, a community meal, and the blood was put over the doorpost so that death would pass over. It wasn't killed instead of anybody.
Yeah, well, exactly. And actually, oh yeah, the Passover is fascinating. Hold on, I am looking something up real
Yeah.
quick, but because yeah, Khnum, I wanted to make sure I had the name right. So Khnum is the goat god, the goat god, the goat-headed god of the Egyptians was actually the god of children,
Mhm.
and oddly enough, that's the last what happens. Well, the firstborn are all killed,
Mhm.
and but what do you have to do to be outside of that punishment or that judgment? You have to slaughter Khnum. You have to kill their icon of their god of children and their god, and they believe that also, ironically enough, they believe that this god of children shaped children out of the clay, which should sound very Genesis to you.
Yeah.
And this was God making a very clear mockery and doing polemics and judgment against the gods of Egypt. So you had to slaughter their icon in front of them and then take the blood and cover the doorpost, which is a mark of covenant of God's people. And so you're saying, I no longer, and it shows in Exodus that there was a mixed multitude, means not just Israelites, a mixed multitude left Egypt, which means that there's a bunch of Egyptians who got around, slaughtered the Khnum as well, and marked themselves under Yahweh because they went, okay, this is the real God. We are now under him and his covenant, blood being a sign of covenant of life being pledged. And in order to do that, you slaughter the icon of the gods, which is super metal, by the way. Like that's
Yeah.
like the most metal thing I've ever heard in my life. Like then you also consume it like at a meal in thankfulness to the one true God. It is like it's intense.
It's
Yeah.
interesting you bring that up because before we were talking about peace offerings, the Bas Elamim, and that was in the Ugaritic text too. So a lot of the things that the peace offerings did that like we look back and we kind of look at that as just Israel in the same way that you're talking about the sacrifices being that was very cultural. I mean, we could spend days talking about it, but when you really digest into this and you look at like the roots of the peace offerings both for Israel and outside of that, and then you get into the different sacrifices and everything else, like to me, I'm an Old Testament guy. I mean, the Expedition 44 people know like I'm a, classic ancient Near Eastern person. Like that alone is enough for me not to follow PSA because you study every way that it worked in those ancient cultures and you just say it doesn't carry over. Like if you know that, you're missing it with the PSA thing. It doesn't equal out. It's like, okay, you got half of it, but some of this just doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
Right. And well, I mean, Dr. Michael Heiser has talked about it, and T. Wright has talked about it. Many people talk, like, again, this is not new news, but it's funny, and many people haven't attached it to their atonement theory. Like, they haven't
Right.
worked it through their atonement theory filter yet, and how that actually does change things quite a bit. Well, the other thing that's fascinating as well was, so pagans would consume blood. Like, they would, like, think crazy Vikings around a fire before they go to war, and they, like, they slice open the kill a bear, and they consume its blood. And the idea was that they take on the attributes of the strong animal they're consuming before they go to war. So pagans would consume the blood of various creatures to take on its properties. Well, ancient Near East Israel, they were only to one, never consume the blood.
Mhm.
That's putting God again in juxtaposition to the pagan gods. But also, they were only to slaughter docile animals. And the idea was that as this creature is humble and docile and merciful and kind and gentle, so will I. And so it is actually symbolic of what you're supposed to do. Like, it's just fascinating because it's all opposite. And then when you mirror now with all that in mind, and the idea of propitiation, because we all have it in our Bible translations, like Jesus'
Mhm.
propitiation,
Right.
and Matt, you and I, like, this would be a good thing to discuss, but elasterion, the actual Greek word, can mean, of course, appeasement of an angry deity, is what everyone always points out, but it also can mean the mercy seat, which is at the temple where these sacrifices oftentimes would be made, the blood would be applied. It's the place where that would bring about fellowship, where heaven met earth. There's a lot of things other than that. And what's fascinating is that even in Roman culture, sometimes it was to appease an angry god, but other times it was done to party. It was done as
Yeah.
thankfulness. It was even in Roman pagan cultures, they didn't just take propitiation as only equally an appeasement of an angry god.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
So,
there's so
yeah.
much of that in when you connect the Old Testament and the New Testament. Um, Even in the Old Testament, when hilasterion is used as kippur as the noun form, it's the mercy seat. We see this in Romans chapter 3, where so much people want to make it about Jesus appeasing God. Their propitiation used there, which is the improper form of it. It should be mercy seat, because every time that is same word is used in the Septuagint as a noun, it is the mercy seat. It's never the action of appeasement.
Right. And
And
then,
so, yeah, and that is
and
really the major use of it in the New Testament is the mercy seat.
right. And in addition, with Kippur, the Hebrew word, so the Greek translation of that is usually elasterion or elasmos or whatever. But if you go back into Kippur, it is also the same word. It is from the root word from the Akkadians of Kippuru, which is to cleanse,
Yeah.
which goes back into the blood is a cleansing agent, it's a spiritual bleach to get rid of the sin corruption. And then we see the perfect, and then with all that in mind, everything in the New Testament makes so much more sense. Jesus's blood cleanses and washes us because we're covered in this sin stain of the world, and his life covers our death, which is why his resurrection destroys death, which is the final enemy according to Paul, and that he is the first fruits of the resurrection that is to come. So he is the first resurrection, and then we get to follow him. That death is defeated, death is destroyed, death is the power of Satan, according to Hebrews 2:14. And then even all throughout Hebrews, you have this idea of Jesus died. He went into the heavenly places, which would be the temple, right? Because they're a shadow of the things in heaven. And then he cleansed those so that we might enter God's presence. That's why the veil is torn, so you can enter the Holy of Holies, because it's all been cleansed with his life to cover our death. So it's just anyway, it's just really like once you got your Old Testament lined up, the New Testament just goes, you just look at it, you go, oh my gosh, that makes so much more sense.
Yeah, I mean, it makes so much sense of like Hebrews 9, where so many people are like, "Oh, there's no forgiveness without the shedding of blood. Forgiveness of sins without the shedding of blood." I'm like, well, of sins isn't in that, and then what is the blood being applied to in that context? Is the heavenly articles? It's not God killing Jesus instead of you.
Yes, and forgiveness is like release language, or or it also can be like washing language, but it's usually like release from a debt. And
Talk
so,
about forgiveness for a little bit, because you have a chapter on that and looking at Jesus's parables, and even
mm,
the question I brought up earlier is, if we're supposed to forgive the same way God forgives, then do we need to kill somebody?
Right.
then
Matthew 9. This is a great discussion.
yeah, well, no, that's a great point. It's because that's actually another thing that broke my brain was the unforgiving servant.
Yeah.
Like, so you have this servant who owes a great debt to his master, and of course, this goes into the first century context as well of grace. Like, what is grace? Well, it's patron client. He's the master's the patron. This person's the client. The client could not, and the whole point is if your master or your patron blesses you in this way to give you money or to give you what you don't have, you honor them and glorify them because it's an honor shame culture. If you don't do it, it's greatly shameful and dishonoring, and you wouldn't do that. So this patron does this for this master does this for the servant, and the master says, "Hey, you know what? I know you'll never be able to pay me back. It's forgiven. Don't even worry about it. Like it's fine." And then the servant goes
Wait, no
to
blood? Where's the blood in this?
where's my retribution? Like, and he just simply forgives. And then the guy goes, of course, to someone who owes him a little bit of money, and he like beats him up essentially for it and starts threatening him. And when the master finds out, he throws him in jail because he's like, "You did not forgive him as I forgave you." And God tells us to forgive one another as Christ has forgiven us, which means that it's free forgiveness. Otherwise, we're saying that God literally cannot forgive unless there is some sort of repayment, which
Right.
means which means this: I can forgive people. I can forgive people without retribution. I can let them go of a debt. So you're saying that I can do something more moral than God, which I would say is blasphemous.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then there's already a problem here in PSA because it's saying that I can freely forgive somebody, but God cannot
Yeah.
unless he gets his pound of flesh. And remember, it can be and the other thing is like Proverbs straight up says, like God hates those who shed innocent blood. Hates them. I guess very strong language. So then we're saying that, well, in PSA, God shed innocent blood, but I know people will be like, no, it's the crowd who did it, but you're saying God willed it and usually predestined it for it to take place, right? Like that's what you're saying. So that creates a lot of problems.
Yeah,
But
and I even say the Old Testament is gonna allude to that too. Boyd gets really into this, but I mean Psalm 51, Isaiah 1, 11 through 14, Micah 6, Amos 5, Hosea 6. I mean, all of those would seem to be prophets telling God's people that he isn't appeased by these blood sacrifices, but the people want to keep doing this anyway. You kind of get back to just this idea of, is it what the people want or is it what God wants? And that's the sort of the message of the blood there.
right, exactly. No, and in fact, there we have moments in the Old Testament where God outright rejects a
Yeah,
substitute.
yeah.
Like Moses is like, "Hey, strike, like take me instead," and God's like, "No, you've done nothing
Yeah,
wrong.
it doesn't
They're
work that
going."
way.
Yeah.
Exactly. So he's like, "No, they're going down," and of course we see Moses negotiate and all that. But there, we see God actually deny substitutes. And it makes very clear why in Ezekiel 18, because it's unjust for someone, an innocent party, to be punished by the deeds of the guilty. So that all these things and more, of course, causes problems for PSA. And these are all things that the Bible actually refutes and explains if you actually just pay attention and try to understand that verbiage a little bit. So forgiveness is it should always be a free thing. It is something that we are commanded to do, something that God also demonstrates, and it is something of just releasing somebody from a debt. And I've heard PSA advocates, and I don't deal. This is one of those things I didn't deal with in the book. But one of the things I'll hear people say when it comes to like the unforgiving servant is like, well, the master still incurred the debt. Like he still took the punishment, right? So therefore PSA must be right because the master
Yeah.
still incurred the penalty of just letting them go. And I would say only two things in response to that. One, that's not what the text seems to be emphasizing. It's not the
Right,
loss incurred by the master. In fact, God doesn't lose anything. Like he's complete in
right.
himself. So saying that he incurs some sort of thing there. It just doesn't make much sense. But in addition to that, the text not really making that like the focal point. The other thing is that it seems to be focusing on the idea that it was still a free release. Like, so what? I incurred the debt and pay back myself? Is that what I do? No, no, no. The whole point is that it becomes a gift. The
Mhm.
forgiveness
Yeah,
becomes
you
a
also have
gift.
to kind of make the connections of, if you're going to make this an analogy of Old Testament atonement, then you kind of get back to things have to line up. Your hermeneutical lens has to, this has to equal that, very much like a algebraic equation. And so,
Mm-hmm.
this kind of gets into like, in PSA, you want to hear ritual atonement rather than like celebration language and covenantal grace. And boy, when you read exactly what you're saying in here and you take it back to the Old Testament, like the two things don't equal out each other is what I'm going for.
Right.
Like they A plus B, it doesn't work out the same way.
Yeah.
Right. And then, of course, the big one for me that I unpacked that Old Testament, which you guys have done multiple episodes on, is Isaiah 53.
Yeah.
Isaiah 53 is the go-to for everyone when it comes to this topic. But there's obviously multiple issues with the PSA interpretation. One is if you read the Septuagint, you guys have pointed this out in your series, all that like language that was confusing pretty much disappears.
Yep.
It becomes very much a passage on restoration. But
Mhm.
also, like Isaiah 53:1 right there, it says, we considered him or esteemed him to be stricken by God and afflicted. Like, we considered him to be. That means that it's already set up to juxtaposition that we were wrong. We considered him to be this, but in reality, he was healing us.
Mhm.
I'm just so not a fan of Masoretic text. I mean, you're looking at 10th century stuff that gets poured into ESV versions and everything else. And like, I've been saying this for years, but how silly is this? Like that we're stuck on this 10th century text when we have much better text to go with. And if you go with much better text to, I mean, we make a point for the Septuagint and so do you, but like, you just don't get into all of this junk. You wouldn't read it that way and come out with any of those, I would say, preconceived notions because of what the PSA culture has told us that it is. But when you start doing the deep dive into the Greek, the Hebrew, everything else, it's really hard to go that way.
100%. And that's actually what I've never understood either, was why we go with the Masoretic text when we have, do have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we do have
Yeah.
these, like, we have other texts that would be far better to bring our interpretations from. And then also, like, Matthew actually explains parts of Isaiah 53, and it was all about healing and restoration. Again, it was never about punishment or substitution.
So
That
this
broke
is
my
my this
brain.
is my 12-year-old conundrum. You're gonna love this story. I'm 12 years old. I'm growing up in a Bible thumper family. I'm reading all these quotes from the New Testament that are supposed to be quoting the Old Testament. I'm going, none of these quote them. This doesn't work in any kind of grammar I know as a 12-year-old, which ends up sending me on this lifelong pursuit of this, which I actually largely wrote my dissertation on. And that is like when you get to PSA, the problems are what I was working through at 12 years old, and it didn't
Mm.
work for me then, and it still doesn't work for me.
Right. Well, no, and I mean, I was 28 when it started falling apart for me.
Yeah,
Like, and it's so amazing to me that I didn't see it because it's so obvious now. I remember
yeah.
when I'd hear atheists. And for those who don't know, I love apologetics. Like I work with young people, so therefore I work with apologetics a lot.
You
I'm
can have
constantly
it.
yeah, I do it a lot. But what I have found generally speaking, because there's good arguments for God. There's
Yeah.
argument from causation, argument from design. There's different arguments for Christ's resurrection and historicity of the Bible, blah, 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 blah. But what I have found is that the majority reason why a lot of people become atheists is because of poor understandings of biblical theology.
Yep.
And as soon as you can actually present them more accurate biblical theology, they a lot of times go, oh, that's interesting. I never
I
knew
start
that.
every conversation off with them of saying, the reason you left the church, I strongly agree with. I agree with every single reason why you left the church and why what has caused you to not think that the Bible holds water. I agree with you on every single one of those. Now let's work through them.
Right, exactly. And so I have done this where and the atonement was actually one of the ones I'd hear all the time. Oh, so God had to punish himself in order to satisfy
Yep.
himself. Like,
Yep.
well, technically, like people say, oh, that's a straw man. I'll hear PSA people, that's a straw man. I'm like, not really. It's actually what we call a reductio. It's just reducing it down to the bare bones of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Or, God was so angry he had to punish his own son instead of us. Like, how's that not an abusive father? And like,
Right.
I remember hearing those things and I'd try to find ways around it. But the bottom line is their argument actually has some thrust to it. Why? Because it actually goes against God's own goodness. It goes against God's own moral code that's written on all of our hearts. And we know it, that it's wrong. So these are all things that eventually I think that having a more well-rounded view of the atonement, ditching PSA, having a more well-rounded view of the atonement will actually do our apologetic and evangelistic efforts justice, because you can actually explain to people how it was a gift. Christ defeated death for you. Christ destroyed the power of sin and dominion in your life. He defeated the enemies. The enemies that are set against you. He defeated all those at the cross, and he will restore you and heal you and all your brokenness. Like, he calls you onto himself. And that's what the whole, like, people pointed out, the early church fathers, that Christ, his hands were nailed to the cross to embrace the world, as the blood was like marked on the door frames of the wood posts of the door. So too was Christ's blood on the wooden posts of the cross to
And the
embrace
cross
everyone.
was the door frame of the world. Yep.
Exactly. So yeah, these are all just the things that, like, yeah, you're right. And it doesn't work when you're talking to unbelievers. It just doesn't. It's actually revolting to them. And I now that I see it, I get it.
Mhm.
I get it.
Yeah. I would love for you to talk a little bit about chapter 10, the no wrath for the weary, because I mean, I think when a lot of people think about the cross, they think about wrath. And Ryan and I, we've done a whole like video series on the wrath of God, and it comes up a lot here. And you've landed basically in the same place that we do. But I also like your kind of like axiom or whatever logical like pathway of looking at wrath, especially in like Romans chapter 2, that about wrath being future wrath and not wrath at the cross.
Hey, actually, so that's actually a fascinating thing as well, because we're talking about wrath satisfaction. And here's one of the realities that people need to understand with PSA. One of the big reasons why PSA was even developed in the first place was because of limited atonement during the Reformation. I know people like respected people like Dr. William Lane Craig try to say that's not the truth, but it is the truth, because
Yeah.
the reformers ran into a problem, which is, if God satisfied his wrath on Jesus, why is there still hell and punishment? Right?
Mhm.
Okay, well, wrath is either satisfied or it's not. Was Jesus' sacrifice not enough to satisfy God's wrath? No, actually, but that wrath satisfaction must have only been to a limited group. That's the limited atonement. So was the answer to the problem. Was PSA and limited atonement tend to go hand in hand. That's why there's still wrath for the non-elect, right? But when I started going through the text about wrath, I started realizing that the Bible never says anything about wrath being appeased at the cross. In fact, as you point out in Romans 2 that I found when I was reading it, it seems to make very clear that wrath is stored up to be poured out on the day of the Lord, which would be the eschaton, when Christ returns and separates the sheep from the goats. And then he pours out his wrath on those who rejected him, which those who rejected him, it makes sense if you understand the cosmic powers and the cosmic struggle, because it means that all those who rejected him rejected goodness itself and therefore aligned themselves with evil and the devil. Therefore, you're anathema to God, because you're set in juxtaposition to goodness. So yeah, it's stored up. It never says, in fact, it says the opposite of being poured out. It says, no, it's still being stored up, and he forbears with mankind.
Mhm.
So it's the opposite there. And then in addition, as you've pointed out, Matt, wrath in the Old Testament was a lot of times more passive than it was aggressive.
Mhm.
Now, granted, God does have moments like Sodom and Gomorrah where he does just absolutely burn it to a crisp. That's absolutely true. But
Mhm.
generally speaking, God's wrath is usually a removal of his protections and blessings and then letting what will happen then happen.
Yeah.
Like, when Israel was under God's wrath, they were no longer under God's blessing and protection. So therefore, foreign nations were able to have their way with them.
Mhm. Yeah, in Romans
So,
chapter 1, Paul says 3 different times that for their rejection of God, God handed them over to the things they desired. And he declares that that is the definition of God's wrath. Paul, like, literally defines it there.
right. So in other words, God's wrath is you creating your own hells.
Uh-huh.
That's That's it. Like when people are experiencing a lot of horrible things in your life because of terrible decisions, that's actually part of God's wrath because you have set yourself in juxtaposition to goodness and to righteousness, and part of doing that which is wicked is you get the devil's currency, which is suffering.
Yeah.
That's what you're going to experience.
I think it's
So yeah,
funny you bring out the only time that the wrath of God and the cross is mentioned is in Romans chapter 5, verse 9. And it talks about because of the blood we are saved from the wrath, but that wrath in Greek is in future tense
mm-hmm.
still. And so it's more of a picture of the Exodus. Because of the blood on the doorposts, death passes over.
Right,
The blood on the
exactly.
doorposts, you experience death.
In fact, I've had Romans 5:9 thrown at me a lot by PSA advocates. They'll be like, right there. Like I actually I just remember there was one Twitter conversation I had where someone quoted Romans 5:9, since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. And the person was like, checkmate. And I'm like, it doesn't say wrath was a peace at the cross though.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not really any better for it. Like this doesn't help you. You know that, right? Like it just says we are saved by him from the wrath of God. It doesn't say when.
Yeah.
Like you said, in the Greek it's future tense, so that should tell you it's at the eschaton. But that otherwise it just says I'm saved from it, which by the way, everyone agrees.
Yeah.
Like everyone of every atonement school agrees. I think even universalists would agree. Like you're saved from the wrath
Yeah.
because that's the whole point of the salvation process.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, that I find, yeah, and that's why I entitled it "No Wrath for the Weary" because he says his burden is light, his yoke is easy, his burden is light. So if you're weary, there's no wrath for you
Mhm.
because you go to Christ and He restores you. You don't have to experience that. He saves you from it, and He spares you because you humbled yourself and you came to Christ.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think that particular chapter was fun as well because we also discussed and you helped me a little bit with that chapter because we also discussed how a lot of these things will be revealed like in Peter and all the other things that people have the wrong idea of how God is going to even deal with the sins of the world, and it says that he's going to uncover it and he's going to find it.
Mhm.
And that's when he's going to burn it to cinders. It doesn't
Expose
say,
it. Yeah.
yeah, he's going to expose it. He's not going to punish Jesus. So these are all things that the Bible is, again, if you just read it within context, it just makes sense.
Yeah.
I think probably the most difficult one for people to understand, and I have a section on it, but it's 2 Corinthians 5:21.
Yeah. Like,
Because
he became sin.
yeah, he who knew no sin became sin for us. And I can actually understand why, if that's all you had, why you would be like, I don't know, man, that seems to go in favor of PSA. And yeah, I'd say on a surface, that is actually one of the stronger arguments. I'd say it's actually a stronger text than Isaiah 53. But what a lot of people don't realize that in the Greek, if you that the same word for sin and sin offering, hamartia,
Yeah. Same.
same thing. Sin offering are the same exact thing. Same thing when it comes to the Hebrew, when you're dealing with chatat. That these are words that if you use them side by side can mean sin or sin offering. And I think Paul is setting up a parallel here. He made him who knew no sin to become a sin offering for us. He's doing a parallelism, which
Yeah.
is very normal.
And a sin offering had to be unblemished. It was the life of the blood of the unblemished animal cleansed the impure thing.
Mm-hmm.
so that it would become pure, the righteousness of God.
Right. And, and people point out that sin offering is really a poor translation of it because it actually is more of a purification offering.
Yeah, yeah, and even was it Mounts, who holds to PSA, says
Mm-hmm.
that that is a misinterpretation of this verse.
Yeah.
This verse can't be used as PSA, even though he holds to it.
Right, exactly. And that's actually my favorite part is that there's a lot of parts where it's been fascinating reading PSA advocates because they actually all disagree with each other on a
Oh
lot
yeah,
of things.
Yep.
Because I think it's actually, and I mean, this might be my cynical side coming out, but I think there is the reason why is because you actually cannot get there. So they all have to deal with it. But a guy named Kendall Easley, he said this about this passage. He affirms PSA, and this is how he tries to get there. Paul's language is careful. He did not say Jesus became a sinner, which would be untrue. Rather, Jesus became the representative sin bearer. He identified 100% with the sin of the world when he died on the cross, which, and then he says that God, right here, God treated Jesus as if he were sin itself, which
Yep.
contradicts.
brings it to, yeah, which
Right.
contradicts itself. Like, and also, how can someone even like, if I identify with someone's sin 100%, does that not mean I would become corrupted by it because I identify it with it? It's like if you
Becomes part
identify
of
with it,
you.
that's part of you. Exactly. It's if it's part of Jesus, then he did become sin.
Mhm.
So it becomes a distinction without any meaningful difference.
I mean, you see it the same way with Leon Morris, who holds to PSA, but the way that most PSA advocates want to explain ransom theory want to say that basically God paid himself off through Jesus being the ransom, essentially. And he even makes the case that, like, yeah, nowhere in the Old Testament and the New Testament does it ever say who the ransom is paid to, that the ransom is only about the releasing of slaves, not who gets paid off. And
Right.
you go into that whole Lutron and yeah, the whole release of slaves connected to the Exodus there. But even like PSA advocates like Leon Morris admit that yeah, you can't take this too far, where the PSA advocates take it too far.
Right, right. Well, I mean that's and I mean the first few centuries of the church, there was a lot of like confusion even on ransom language. Like it was kind of fascinating. It's been something that has been elusive to people, it seems like throughout the years, but really just means freedom, like freedom at a
Oh yeah.
cost.
Mhm.
Um,
Freeing of slaves,
yeah, and then so
not
once
who
you
gets
go,
paid,
yeah, exactly. It's not really about who's getting paid.
just about
Um,
freedom.
Wait, I want to know who gets paid. Where do I write the check here? Come on.
Will Hess, you write the check to.
No, I mean,
uh,
even in the Exodus, the release of slaves was by God's right hand, smashing the gods of Egypt and the Pharaoh.
right. There's
And I
about
mean, that totally
defeating
plays into
evil.
Christus Victor, which
Right.
I think kind of leads us to like you make a historical case for classic view. And would you explain like how you, through your study, like see atonement now? Where what's a way that people can see atonement where they don't need this the unbiblical views of PSA?
Yeah. So what I did was I spent uh, an unreal amount of hours just reading through church fathers on this topic. And one of the things I realized was that like they would use similar word, but they use the same words but different dictionaries.
Yep.
So when they talked about the penalty that would be incurred by Jesus, that penalty would actually be mean his mortality, that he became man.
Mhm.
So he took on the corruption of sinful flesh, essentially, that the likeness of sinful flesh. He took on the corruption of mortality. So I instantly started seeing that penalty was wrong, the way that we view it. Even the way like punishment was used was oftentimes in again a view of just being mortal, not the idea of God needing to punish. In fact, I saw Lisa Childers posted a YouTube short quoting Augustine, misunderstanding Augustine's point. By the way, Augustine's probably the one that started a lot of this stuff,
Yeah.
but and then Anselm took off with it. Then of course the Reformation, but like Augustine did not hold a PSA,
Yeah.
and so
I mean, even Winger conflated, who is it, Tertullian or something. I think you have a video correcting his use of even ransom, where he is conflating ransom and substitution.
yeah, and that happens all the time with these conversations. But then what? So the way I would describe atonement now There's a lot of things. So I unpack like what is sin, what is death. All these things are unpacked in the book. But the long story, the long version short would be the idea that once mankind fell into sin, the cosmic power of sin entered the world and brought corruption and mortality. We were cast out of the garden because we were no longer pure in that sense. So the tyrannical power of sin had power over us. So that could be Satan, that could be the dominion forces, however you want to unpack that, you have it. But sin and evil had dominion, which means that we were its slaves. And it was our master. And Christ came hidden in mortal flesh because Satan apparently held us. And that's why there's temptations and all those things. It actually explains a lot of stuff, what was going on in the background, because Christ came preaching the kingdom of God is at hand. Well, if you were a Satan, you would take that as an eviction notice. So what you're going to do? Well, you're going to try to kill the man who's bringing this kingdom. Well, unfortunately for Satan, God knew what Satan would do, and that's where the cross became his ultimate undoing. He had no idea the consequences. So the way I would just explain is that you were corrupted by sin, and therefore you are under the power of death, and you would die and suffer condemnation. But Christ died to pour his blood out to purify you, to restore you into a proper image bearer of God, to take on the vocation of God, which is the kingdom that is at hand, that is not of this world, to be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ, to bless others. And so that way, when Christ resurrected, he now promises you a resurrection in that new creation that you are helping bring about in the kingdom. That is like the long story short. The atonement is to bring fellowship while also destroying the power of sin and death over you. Christ destroyed the cosmic powers of evil that held us down and brought us into restoration into his kingdom. And now we can fellowship with one another and fellowship with him, and we can look forward to the new creation and the resurrection.
Yeah, so I see it the way that you explain it, which I love, is it's simultaneously a rescue mission and a restoration mission.
Yes,
Yep.
that's exactly it. And just to real quick, I saved this particular. You guys will notice that my what I would call my sauciest chapters at the end, and the reason why was because I was like, I need to make sure that people like me before I get here. It was a strategic moment. It was because my second to last chapter is pagan substitutionary atonement. And the reason why I called it that is, and Will, I know you've also written on this before, and so I'd love to hear your thoughts here. But basically, what I did is, so everything in the Bible constantly parallels God with the other gods and how he's greater than them. There is a lot of polemics like that in scripture. God talks about his high mountain. Well, all the other gods are on mountains, but God, right. our God is on the high mountain. Like there's like these constant little like subtleties in the text that God is like slapping around with, say that Jesus is Lord of Lords or King of Kings as a direct polemic against Caesar, who is considered a god, who is a king. In Revelation, Jesus being held up as the crowd in the clouds, there's lightning that came from him. But it's like, well, that's a direct polemic against Zeus. Zeus was the top god. No, Jesus is. That right, all these things are, the Bible does this all throughout, where it's like, if you understood, like we read it, we go, ooh, powerful, like lightning powers. It's like, no, it is directly painting a picture that the people of the first century would know, because it was Zeus that came on the clouds with lightning, not the God of the Bible. And the God of the Bible says, no, it's actually me. So what happened was, I've realized a good way to understand if one of your beliefs is just pagan, or if this happens to share some sort of common ground with paganism, but God has corrected it. A good example of this, I mentioned it in the book, is the image of God. Image is, in the Hebrew, is salim. In Greek is icon or akon, and that is the same word that we translate idols. And so we are the idols of God, one could say. And you go, well, what's the point of that? Well, the point is that the reason why God is so offended by actual idols, these images that are carved, is because an image, it brings to memory what they represent. It also is usually a sign of territory. And so God is saying, no, I hate it when you make graven images because one, that graven image does not own that territory. I'm the creator. Also, the thing that's calling to memory is not my image bearers or myself. He wants us to be his image bearers. So he wants us to represent him here on earth, which is why idols are so offensive, because they are actually that's kind of giving up that birthright that we have to somebody or something else. So with all that in mind, I was like, okay, well, if PSA is true, then there ought to be some sort of parallel between paganism and PSA, where PSA sets the record straight. Where it's like, no, this is what the pagans do, but this is how PSA, this is how penal substitution works in a godly way. And the more and more I looked into pagan cultures, I couldn't find a corrective penal substitute anywhere compared in scripture to them. It actually, the reality is, this might upset some people who are listening, but at the end of it, I don't know how we can't just say that then PSA is paganism outright.
You know, the thing when I was reading the book, and as you alluded to, I've been studying this for a long time. I've written articles, Matt and I have done videos on it. But the chart that you made that kind of goes through paganism, Reformed PSA, mere PSA, non PSA, that's huge. Talk about that for a second.
Yeah, so that chart was actually inspired by my friend Joshua Sherman, because he's like, what you need to do is I think you're going to need to put this up in a chart so people can follow you, follow your point a little bit better. And so I'll give credit where credit's due on that. That was Joshua Sherman. And so, but what happened with that is, so and for those who are wondering, it's right here in the book. It's the chart, because what we need to understand is how sacrifices worked, as I mentioned, in the Old Testament and with paganism. But so paganism oftentimes viewed sacrifices as bribes to gods for blessings. Like if you were going to go take a giant shipment of gold across the seas to a buyer, you would make a sacrifice to someone like Poseidon that that the seas would have good favor upon you. So that way your shipment
gets wrapped and it come back to burn you up along the way.
Exactly. And you don't want all your gold to land in the bottom of the ocean. Okay. This is before insurance was a thing. So you really didn't want that to happen. So they would bribe. And I don't see how in penal substitution, how it's not the same thing, where I'm going to be the innocent person that steps in the way to bribe you to, if you kill me, you'll spare everyone else. That I don't see how it can be any other way. So what I did is I created a chart where we have paganism, Reformed PSA, mere PSA, and non-PSA Christian. I'll explain each one real fast. Paganism obviously is the idea of appeasement of your angry deity. It is giving offerings for bribes and for blessings, all those things. Reformed PSA is what I would consider the most extreme form of penal substitutionary atonement, which is not only that Christ died for the elect alone, but that God's wrath was a burning hot iron that was going to be poured out on everyone, and that he had to punish somebody, and Jesus stepped in and he sent his son because he had to punish somebody, so he sends his son so he could punish Jesus, so that way he could feel better about it. Then there's mere PSA, which is I think what a lot of Christians hold to, which is really just like a less intense version of PSA, where they might not say like God damned Jesus on the cross, or they might not say that the Trinity was torn apart, but they will still say, Jesus took the punishment for our sins. It is kind of
you're a lot nicer about that than I am. I would just say that's the middle of the road that like people don't understand what they've gravitated towards some of the PSA definitions, but like if you really sit down and explain them, well, if you believe that's where this leads to, then they kind of back off and go, maybe I'm a 2-point Calvinist then,
Well, so what happens when a lot of people get this cognitive dissonance, they will end up like, well, I don't want to go full committed to what the logical implications of that is. But it's the only framework I'm comfortable with, but I'm not going to take. It's like the same thing when I talk to Calvinists, when I break down the 5 points, and that means God, chooses some and not others, which, that means that there must be favoritism in God. There's a lot of things like that where, well, no, I'm like, well, that's the only
what that means.
Means. Like that's the only one. Like I'm not trying to make you look bad. I'm just walking you down to where you led me. All right. You led me to the water. Now I drink. So So mere PSA is just that, where someone might try to like dial it back a little bit. But really, I don't think I think there's a distinction without any meaningful difference, but I put it in there just to make the people who are like, well, I'm not that extreme about it, feel a little bit more happy. But reality is that there's no difference. Then I put non-PSA Christian, which is what me, you, and Matt are all. But that's what I put in here. So can sacrifices be properly just understood as bribes? Well, under paganism, absolutely. Reformed and not mere PSA are all yes, because it can be understood as that. I gave this in order to find favor upon you. But in a non-PSA Christian, no. This offering of Jesus wasn't to satisfy God's wrath or
You
make him
got a
feel
line
better.
in there that I think you should have bolded or put by itself. It says a non-PSA Christian just views these as gestures for purification of thankfulness, fellowship, and covenant. That is huge.
Bingo. So it's not a bribe. It is not a
Yep.
bribe at all. And this actually, and you could go through because I have it in the chart, could proper sacrifice involve torturing the sacrificial victim? Well, under everything, that's yes, except for a non-PSA Christian.
Right. Yep.
Were sacrifices understood as propitiation? Well, under everything, which is the propitiation being the idea of wrath satisfaction, all of them would be yes. And I put maybe for non-PSA Christians because it depends on how we want to define wrath. Do you mean like wrath appeasement? Do you mean like wrath was avoided or no longer necessary?
Yeah,
Then
we got an
sure.
episode on that one too.
Yeah,
That's a hard one because you're right. That's going to be those in the non-camp still have some messed up thoughts well, I guess I would say that in terms of propitiation, but yeah, there's some ditches there.
right. And which is why it's a maybe. But even then, like if its wrath is no longer necessary or if it's abated, then it's not satisfied. It's just like when I'm getting, frustrated with my child because she's not listening, and I go, I will spank you, and she gets right back into like does exactly what I asked her once I made the threat. Well, then that turns into, well, it's not so much I'm satisfied, it's the fact that, well, it's no longer necessary for me to make any sort of
Right. And you
punishment.
hit
So
that on the head when you say, is there a version of propitiation always wrath appeasement? That's the question.
which is no. So
Yeah.
that's why it's like I put a maybe there. When examining propitiation, does this entail wrath appeasement? All of them are yes, besides the non-PSA Christian. And finally, is sacrifice synonymous with ritual death? And this is what's fascinating. Paganism is no, because it's not always ritual death, because sometimes they did things as gestures of thankfulness as well in covenant too. Reformed PSA and mere PSA, though, is always yes. Sacrifice has to be ritual death. But the non-PSA Christian is a no. So actually, if we're looking for proper polemic parallels between paganism and Christianity, the non-PSA Christian has found it. We have found it in the fact that it's not a bribe, it's the act of covenant and fellowship, and it is not always ritual death. You have now found your parallel of how Christ's sacrifice is a direct polemic against the pagan gods, because also instead of a pagan god demanding you give up and sacrifice to appease them, Christ came and gave himself, God came down to us and gave himself up for fellowship with us. It's now the inverse of what we would expect in paganism. So boom, there you have it. So if you're trying to actually comb through those things, you will find it. You just have to find the right way. And otherwise, paganism is just paganism outright then, because it just turns into bribery. So
That's that.
sorry. I don't make the
I love
rules.
that.
All right. I just remember I preached PSA. So like, that's why it's like, I feel like I could be a little bit more saucy in that. We're like, no, this is just where this how the cookie crumbles. And I had to stand up and face the music,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Exactly. So your book is called.
I was glad that you brought out Davis's quote of talking about typical offerings of hospitality of meat, beer, vegetables, flowers, incense. I mean, that was a good point.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's exactly what they were. It was fellowship is all it was.
Yeah.
Which is why actually, man, I mentioned this at the very beginning of the book, but it's why there's a difference between East and the West. The East and the West are very different churches, but the East outright denies any form of satisfaction theory.
Yeah.
And that's why they still have incense in their churches. They still have this altar where they do all this stuff, because they still look at it, and they look at the Eucharist now as that fellowship offering that is pleasing to God. So it's fascinating because we in the West only see PSA. And we say this is classical Christianity. I'm like, well, if that's the case, then why is the Eastern Orthodox Church outright rejected it for years if that was part of the core? And
Yeah.
actually, the Catholic Church does not affirm PSA either.
All right, I read books all the time, and this is on my. I've read this 3 times now. This is Gilchrist, and it talks exactly. I just happen to have it right next to where we're having this conversation. It hits this one on the head.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. I have not read that. I've actually wanted to, but I haven't read that one yet. But yeah, so the book, for those of you who are wondering, it is Crushing the Great Serpent. Did God Punish Jesus? Check out that artwork, by the way. Thank you, Will Ryan, for that. And also writing me an endorsement on the back. That was a nice that was a nice touch. It was funny because I've had so many people say, "Dang, that book looks good." Like, if you can judge a book by its cover, that's the one. I'm like, and that wasn't me, but I'm glad you made it hot. Like, it
So
looks
not very
good.
many people know this. I think you just let the cat out of the bag. That's my former life of graphic design. But one of my good buddies that knows me well actually said, like, you did his book better than you've done any of yours. What's going on over there? And I agree. It looks really good. I'm glad I could bless you that way.
No. It was funny because the first one you made, I was like, oh, I like that. And then you were like, oh, I made some other ones. And then you shot that at me, and I'm like, that's the one.
That's the one.
That's the
Yeah.
one I want to pick up and read that book, and I already know what's in it. Like, it just looks good.
Use mine.
Yeah.
Remember the one I sent you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I cannot use that one, Matt. That'll be for the sequel.
Yeah.
Well, Will, again, man, we could do this all day long, and I want to. Like, I want to like do this every week for the next 2 years. But this has been really great hearing some of the behind the book thoughts, and we always are really thankful when authors kind of give us more than what the book says, and you've very much done that. We've heard the reasoning and the thoughts going behind it, and I mean, it's just been an excellent interview today. I thank you for writing the book. I thank you for putting all this into it. Tell us a little bit more. One thing I love about your book is it actually, I want to be careful how I say this, it doesn't do too much. I love it when you read a book and you just can't wait to get more to dive in. And I feel like that's one of the things that your book does so well is it like it's not it's long, don't get me wrong. When I first told you I was going to read it, I'm like, yeah, I'll read it tomorrow, and you're like, it's 300 and some pages, I don't think you're going to read it tomorrow. It's exhaustive, so don't get me wrong, you did a great job of covering all your bases there, but on the other hand, it's not 1,200 pages. And
Right.
so what are some things that you're hoping the book accomplishes, and what's the deep dive to go farther?
Yeah, and so like I said, what I wanted to do is present a book that was able to just tackle the topic of atonement in comparison to penal substitutionary atonement and go, what's the alternative and what are the problems? And I will deal with what I call in the book the main pillars of PSA, or at least as far as my measurement of them has been. I believe these are the main pillars of PSA because these are the main pillars that I had, and I've heard many people object to. So I think it was a pretty accurate view of what the main pillars are. And what I wanted to do was kind of do like a bird's eye view of the main issues, where I just like, what's this? All right, tackle that. What's this? All right, let's knock that down. There are oodles of resources on this stuff. But what I wanted to do was give people a taste of what is there to be able to go, well, if I wanted to look into that further, I now know that thing exists. Because one of the biggest problems I had when this was unfolding for me was I didn't know it existed. I didn't know what other incarnation restoration theology was. I didn't understand what it meant for the deification of man and how that all worked out in the East. I didn't understand the different offering systems in paganism, because you're also dealing with, you have to read an entire book or multiple books maybe or articles on sacrifice and offerings in the Roman culture and the Greek culture, because that references both in scripture. Oh, and the ancient Near East, like Mediterranean area, like the Canaanites versus like there's a lot there. In addition, understanding the book of Hebrews, like I mean, how many books have been written about the book of Hebrews? I mean, let's just be honest.
Yeah.
So like there's so many things, or cosmic forces. That's not, we didn't talk too much about that today, but like, what do cosmic forces do? Like think Dr. Michael Heiser with the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Like, how does that play into your atonement if there's these territorial beings? Like all these sorts of stuff. Like I wanted to just present an umbrella argument against it, but bring in enough of those pillars that to knock down the PSA pillars, but also to show people that these things exist and you can go further. And go look into that and look into whatever part of this interests you the most. If you want to research wrath, go research wrath. If you want to research, propitiation or relationship to, elasterion, go do that. Like, but my biggest mission for this book was to knock down the main pillars of PSA to be able to put this in a layperson's hands. It's 331 pages, which is not small, but it's also not gigantic. My original goal was 200 pages, and I quickly realized that for me to knock down the pillars that I wanted to knock down, there's no way I could do it in 200 pages, not at least do it justice.
Yep.
So what I chose to do instead was to make the book a little bit longer, but also make it very readable and digestible for a normal person. I didn't want it to be too academic. In fact, I got a message the other day. Okay, when does the dumb version come out? And I was like, this is the dumb version. Congratulations, you found it. Because that's the thing is I think of my dad. All right, my dad was like one of the people I was thinking about when I was writing this, which is he works 55 hours a week at a manual labor job for General Motors in a factory. He had 4 kids at home. A bunch of us were homeschooled. We didn't have enough money for him to pay people to do projects, so he had to do it all himself, which means his time was very limited. Well, how does a man like him get a proper theological education on penal substitutionary atonement?
Yep.
Not everyone's scholars, and not everyone is able to do what we do. So I actually had him read the book after Matt read it, and Matt, of course, was like, "This is fantastic, well done."
Yep.
Well, that's Matt. Okay, he's got a doctoral level degree. Like,
Right,
okay,
right.
so I had my dad read it.
He crushes books in his sleep.
Yeah, literally. Like my dad, I had him read it, and he was like, "This has changed my life." Like he was like, "This has completely changed my entire outlook." And we spent multiple hours on the phone unpacking it further afterwards. And I had a normal a normal pastor read it, and he said the same thing. So once I realized that, like, people on a doctoral level, even Braxton Hunter was like, "You should be very proud of this work." So I have people on doctoral levels and normal people and pastors all saying the same thing. This is digestible and solid. Like, and at that point, I felt like my mission was successful because I didn't want it to also be a bore because the other problem is with pop level books, sometimes it bores the more theologically minded people who are more academic. I wanted to try to shoot for that bullseye as close as I could. And it was challenging, but I think we got there.
Yeah, it's fantastic, Will. You should be really proud of it. And it drops on Reformation Day, so we're all praying for a reformation in I guess our wings of the church, the Western church, when it comes to atonement. I think I say it at the end of my my foreword is that really this comes down to the character of God.
Yeah.
So much of this, like in Ryan, I always come back to that, the Exodus 34, was it 6 and 7? God is compassionate and gracious, loving, slow to anger, abounding in faithful love. Like the character of God displayed not only in the Father, but in the Son, who is the perfect representation of the Father. PSA just flies in the face of that representation in Scripture, I feel. And this is such an important work because like you said, it's one of those things that atheists will poke back against. But what you lay out in this book really unveils the character of our Father, the character of the Son, and what the Spirit is doing to produce salvation within His people. So you should be proud of it.
Thanks, man. Well, I am, and more and more I become like, I'm like, no, I feel, because whenever, and Ryan, you've written books and stuff, and I think you guys, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but you guys are working on something. I don't know if that's been announced. Okay.
Yeah,
but the thing is like, there's a point in time where you just have to let the book go. Like you have to realize you're not going to be able to cover everything that you might want to, but you got to let it go. And I wasn't sure if I felt like I dealt with everything adequately. And I just recently reread through my book, and I was like, you know what? I actually think this is right in the sweet spot of where I wanted to. I might have added one or two other things, but overall, this is where I wanted it to be. And so I'm really excited about it. And one of the things for me is I wanted to show people that just because you deny PSA does not make you a theological liberal, doesn't make you a progressive. In fact, you can be. I consider myself very biblically conservative, and so that's why I wanted to approach it from a biblically conservative way, because I
I
hear
think you hit it right on the head. Even you're talking about being scholarly, there's, I believe, 480 footnotes in it. And I was just preaching with a guy. I don't preach very much, but I was just preaching with a buddy down in Illinois. And like, going through it, like I literally want to footnote every part of the sermon. I'm like, and here's this book and here's this quote. And, the guy I'm preaching with is like, enough. Like, we just want to give him like the idea of it, and I think you walked that really well. Like there's enough footnotes, enough where to find it, to go look it up, to like, trust your work, so to speak. But you don't get the sense reading it that it's inundated that way. It reads, like you said, it will read very well to somebody that has never done this. I attempted to do that with my first book, and I had people saying things like, gosh, I had to read it 8 times before like I could get it all, and to your I don't feel that way with yours. Like I read a paragraph and it's like I don't need to reread it. Like it made sense that way. It was almost like a fireside conversation. You also have a way of I believe you've kind of described this, in that you still have relationships with those in the PSA camp and Reformed and things like that. And I wouldn't be greatly offended, if I was in that camp reading the book.
right. And that was also the idea, because actually, like the church I pastor at, I'm in the minority now. There's people in the church who hold in my camp. But
Yeah.
the pastor I work with, even I warned him. It was actually really funny when I interviewed at the church. He was like, "All right, so what do you think about this?" They just started asking the controversial questions, like, how do you feel about women in ministry? How do you feel? And I was like, you know what? I just was like, let me just peel off the Band-Aid real quick for you. I'm just going to tell you my most controversial positions, and you tell me whether or not you think you can make any of them work, and then no hard feelings either way. Then, I was like, I don't believe in inherited guilt from Adam. I don't believe that's how sin works. I don't, I believe in annihilation. I don't believe in eternal conscious torment. And he goes, same, same. And I was like, okay, I went through a few others, and I went, also, I think penal substitutionary atonement is bunk. And I'm actually going to probably be releasing a book within the next year about that. And he goes, okay, that one's a little weird, but that's okay. And I think he said he's halfway through the book. So I
That's
told him
awesome.
to read it, and he was like, he said he was a little leery, but then he's very big on the history of the church, and his statement was this, like, at the beginning of the book, you mentioned how there's no early church creed that lays out an atonement view, and then I was like, all right, well, it's free game. And I'm like, perfect. So then, when a PSA affirming person says that, Braxton Hunter is a PSA affirming person. When I'm hearing these things from PSA people, that I wasn't so hyperbolic and so polemical against them that they felt offended, it made me feel good. Even though there were some things where I didn't hold punches, but I also tried to be like William Lane Craig, his book on penal substitution. I love William Lane Craig. Like every other person who loves apologetics does. Now, I don't always agree with him. I did not like his book on the atonement. I actually thought he dismissed things that shouldn't have been dismissed, and I don't think he did with what he needed to do in it. But
Yeah.
like, I didn't want to dog him too hard.
Yeah.
Because he is a very respectable person, and I do like him, but I wanted to set the record straight on a few things. So
Yeah. And I love your approach better than his, because you're basing yours on scripture where he's trying to make scripture fit into medieval feudal law.
right,
Yep.
It's
right,
really what it comes down to. So
yep,
you're
yep, yep.
basing it in the ancient Near Eastern texts, in the ancient Greco-Roman texts, in the Hebraic texts of the New Testament and Old Testament, and you're basing your information based on the original audience, where he's assuming medieval law and then putting the biblical text on top of medieval law.
100%.
Yeah. And so I did not like his book either, but
Yeah,
I
yep,
like
yep.
I like him. So
That's the worst part. Like, the worst part about it is when you really, really strongly disagree with somebody who you really like. It's like the worst thing, because you're like, well, I don't want to be a nasty, but I also want to correct the record strongly. So I feel so I'm glad sounds like the mission has been successful so far.
Yep. Cool.
But yeah, the release date is October 31st of 2024, which is Reformation Day. That was my editor's idea. He's like, well, if this really became big in the Reformation, then you should release on Reformation Day coming up. And I was like, that's diabolical. Let's do it.
Yeah. Great. All right. Well, thanks.
All right, William L. Hess, thank you. Crushing the Great Serpent. Did God punish Jesus? This has been a wonderful conversation. Matt, great job writing the foreword on this. Awesome team effort all the way across. I hope everybody, as a result of hearing this interview, goes out and buys it for a friend. I think the word just really needs to get out. It's concise, it's convincing. It hits to the point, not too long, not too short. You did a great work with it. Expedition 44 crew, I'm glad you guys tuned in for this. Let's support Will in every one of these ongoings. I hope there's more to come. Thank you. May the Lord bless and keep you.